Let's take a break from our PHP and talk about asset management. We use Laravel Elixir and Gulp to make this incredibly simple. So before we take a look at our Gulp file, you'll see that Laravel includes a package.json file. Most build tools like Gulp and Grunt use what we call Node.js. Now, you need to have that installed on your machine. You can check by running node-v. But if you don't, that's okay, just install it really quickly. You can do that by visiting nodejs.org, clicking install, and you'll be done in less than a minute. It's very, very easy. Okay, so once you have that set up, we need to install our dependencies. Very much like composer.json defines some dependencies, the same is true for our package.json file, but these are node specific. So we just have to run npm install, very much like composer install. Now, if you run this and you see a lot of red, you just need to run sudo npm install and give that 30 seconds to run. All right, that seems to be done, so why don't we dig in? Back to our Gulp file. Now, when you install a fresh copy of Laravel, it'll actually have this. It assumes less by default. So when we run this, we are saying we want to trigger less or compile less. So when we see this, we're saying we want to trigger less on the given file. And this will look for resources, assets, a less folder, and then app.less. But for me, I sort of prefer Sass. And that's what's great about Laravel Elixir. If we want to switch it out, change it to Sass, update the file name, and you're done. Now it's going to look for resources, assets, Sass, and then the file name. Now in this case, we don't even have much here, just a couple declarations. So now I want to compile this down to regular CSS, even though honestly in this state, it is just CSS. But in reality, you'd have some variables or mix-ins or partials and things like that. Anyhow, let's go ahead and run Gulp. And because we wanted to mix our Sass, we triggered it and we get a notification. You'll see that it compiles to this file right here. Pretty cool, right? Now, what if you don't want to run Gulp manually every time? You just want to keep an eye on your changes and re-trigger your Sass. Okay, we just run Gulp watch. And there we go. So now the difference is, yes, we compiled our Sass, but we are watching this file for changes. So why don't we import pages/home? We run it, it's going to fail really quickly because we don't have that file. Let's do that now. Pages, home.scss, and just a little placeholder here. We run it, it compiled. So if we take a look at our app.css file, you'll see that reflected here. Very, very cool. Now, what else can we do? I'm going to hit Control-C to exit out of this. Well, if we return to our Gulp file, maybe you like CoffeeScript. Okay, just tack on coffee and you're done. It will now compile any files within resources, assets, coffee, and why don't we create a module.coffee file here. Class module, save it, and now if we run Gulp again, it'll trigger our Sass, but also our CoffeeScript. And you'll see that reflected right here. So cool. But what about other things? Like, often you will need to combine or concatenate some files. You may know that it's better to have one larger style sheet versus 10 separate ones. Because when you have 10, well, that's 10 HTTP requests. And it's better to merge those into one and just request that single file. Well, once again, with Elixir, it's a cinch. We can use styles to concatenate style sheets and scripts to concatenate scripts. Now, we could continue making it fluent like this, mix.sass.coffee, or if you prefer, you can just create a new mix, whatever you want. So let's mix up some style sheets here. Maybe within your CSS directory, you have some kind of vendor file that you downloaded. How about normalize? We will stub it out. Normalize is just a popular library that normalizes all of the various elements from browser to browser. Okay, so let's say we want to combine these into one and then just make that single request from our master page. Well, here's how to do that. Back to our Gulp file, we will say I want to start with normalize.css at the top and then add to it app.css. But now one issue here. By default, Laravel assumes that any CSS you have will be placed within resources CSS. But in our case, we're interested in looking at public CSS. So we can override that as the third argument. The second argument is the output directory or file name. I'll show you that in just a minute. But then we will add the third argument for the base directory of public CSS. So now, because we added this, we're saying, look for public CSS vendor normalize.css. All right, let's try it out. We run gulp, and this time we're triggering Sass, and then CoffeeScript, and then merging some style sheets. So we should now have an all.css file where we have normalize and then our main app file. So cool. But what if you want to compress this in the process? For production, you want to minify everything. Okay, easy enough. Just tack on the production flag and you're done. It couldn't be simpler. So we come back and now we have that. So why don't we play around with this? I'm going to delete all.css. And now we want a dedicated output file. How about public output final.css? Once we merge everything together, this is the file that we want to reference from our view. Okay, we run gulp again, and now you have that, output final.css. And as you can imagine, we won't go over it, but the exact same thing is true for your scripts. So that will assume resources/JS by default, but if you want to modify that, just set the third argument. So maybe you have something like vendor jQuery.js, and then your main.js file, and then something else, coupon.js, and you want to send those to public output scripts.js, and we want our base directory to be public.js. That's what that might look like. So again, we've made it as simple as possible. What about some other things? We won't cover everything. You can refer to the documentation for that. But mostly, you'll compile some Sass or less. If you like CoffeeScript, you'll run that. If you want to trigger your tests, then you might do that. Let's do PHP unit. Now, if we switch back and run gulp, it'll trigger our tests. And in this case, it failed. Let's see why. Well, within tests, example test, we are requesting the home page and making sure that we have a 200 status code. But if you remember, we don't even have a home page yet. So why don't we say route get home, and we'll just stub it out for now. Return home page. Okay, now if we run it again, we should get green, and we do. And next, very much like gulp watch, if we want to keep an eye on our files and PHP files for changes, I can run gulp tdd. Now try this out. Let's temporarily comment this, run it. It fails. And next, if we run it again, it picks up on the change and reruns it, and we get green. So that's pretty neat. And the same will be true for PHP spec, by the way. Just tack that on, and you're good to go. Finally, the last thing we'll take a look at is versioning of files. So imagine that, let's just delete these, by the way, so we can start from scratch. Well, we do want to run Sass, so mix sass app.scss. Next, we do want to merge some style sheets. So mix styles, and once again, vendor normalize CSS and app.css, and the base directory will be public CSS. Okay, so if we run that, it's true, we will get an all.css file right here. But when you push that up to production, you might have your server cache this for a really long time. And that way we don't have to re-download it each time. We just reference a cached version, right? Well, this is great. But when it comes to making an update, if we even need to change something as simple as this, well, if you were to push that to production, your server would still reference the cached version of the file. So really, we want to leverage cache busting. We could do that like so. Mix, and we're going to call a version method. So we want to version this specific file. So we could say public CSS all.css. Okay, this time if we run it again, you'll see that we have a build directory, and this is where we store everything. And notice that it has this unique extension here. That's how we get the cache busting when we push it up to production. Let me illustrate that a bit more. Why don't we make some kind of change here? Padding top will be 400 pixels. Okay, well, when we run this again, you'll see that the extension updates, as you saw right there. So now you're probably thinking, well, that's cool, but how do I handle this from my view? For example, if we go to our master page, well, we are hard coding that in. And if we were to update it with that extension, well, as soon as we make a change, we have to update this again. Well, actually, no. We have an Elixir function to help you. Elixir, and then we reference our usual path, CSS all.css. So basically, if you're curious, what will happen behind the scenes is Laravel will read our manifest file and figure out that this file actually corresponds to this version. And that is what we will reference. So why don't we try it out? If we switch over to the browser, we have that huge amount of padding that we added. And you'll see that we reference it there. So now, let's switch back and adjust it. Bring this down, and we'll say the color should be purple. Okay, we're not running gulp watch, so we have to rerun it manually. And this time, if we switch back to Chrome, well, to begin, notice that we had that old extension, starting with a 0. Well, if we refresh, you'll see that we're now referencing the new one, and it should be reflected here, like you see. All right, so that has been your introduction to Laravel Elixir. It makes all of these common needs as simple as possible. Whether you need to process your Sass or your less or CoffeeScript, or you want to concatenate some scripts and style sheets, or you want a version for cache busting, or you want to trigger your tests, or lots of other things. So play around with this. I think you'll like it. And in the next video, we will get back to our PHP.